Good evening. It's 6 o'clock and time for another Indie Author Week UK book reading for 2025. And welcome to Wine and a Book, and wishing you cheers and lots of health. Which I think is what cheers means, isn't it? So tonight, it's the third of 8 evenings of the book readings, and this is a forthcoming book rather than an existing one as yet. I'm hoping to get it put together and pulled together, ready for publication in September in our local church, hopefully, if the works that are going on in the chancel make it clear by then. It's supposed to be finished by the end of June, so September, anyway, yeah. So the book tonight is, I'm calling Sitting in Their Landscape. It's all about the churches and chapels and ruined places of worship in the South Downs National Park. And there are 273 plus churches, chapels and ruined places of worship in and just sort of near the edges of the national park. And tonight I'm focusing on 4 of them and how they relate to Jane Austen, because East Hampshire was her stomping ground, and the national park has a lot of East Hampshire, or East Hampshire has a lot of national park, one way around or the other. So there's 4 churches, and one is Chawton, one is Farringdon, one is Warnford, and one is Wickham. So the first one, Church of St Nicholas, Chawton. The area around Alton is often referred to by the tourist industry as Jane Austen country, which, to be fair, is exactly what it has seemed to be when working on the South Downs churches. There have been villages such as Chawton, utterly synonymous with her presence, but also others that she used as names for people or places in her books, such as Wickham. Knightley has cropped up too, as has Knighthorn, as has Lady Catherine de Burgh, albeit born after she was gone. Chawton used to be a small village on the Turnpike Road south out of Alton. It was busy in a more interesting sense than the hurly-burly of the impatient A31 and A32 that at least now bypass the village, but only since 1971. The house that Jane and her mother and sister, both called Cassandra Austen, moved into in 1809, when Jane was in her 30s, was right next to the staging point on the turnpike, and they would watch the changeover from their windows. This house was part of the Chawton estate. I've got photographs, actually. I should have done that. So that is Chawton Church and Chawton House in the background, where her brother Edward lived. So this house was part of the Chawton estate. Jane's brother Edward had been adopted by distant relatives called Thomas and Catherine Knight, and he inherited their estates in 1808. His family all took the name of Knight in 1812 as part of his inheritance. It gave him the chance to look after his mother and sisters. Chawton Church is in the grounds of the park next to Chawton House. The remaining fabric of any age is 13th century, although a substantial part of the building was destroyed by fire not long after Jane's death. So the 19th century rebuild has changed its character quite a bit from that of the 18th century and previously. It is surrounded by leafy parkland just below the imposing frontage of Chawton House, Lime trees soar to the sky all around. There are old yews in the small churchyard, which is walled in by a fancy rounded brick palisade. Both Cassandra Austen graves are to the south of the church, side by side, the elder from 1827, the younger 1845. The tithe map is dated 1838. Cassandra Austen, Jane's sister, was still living in the house that they had all shared. Reverend Charles Knight was rector from 1837 to 67 and was in the rectory just outside the park. He was Jane's nephew, one of her brother Edward's sons. He had been called Austen until his father took the name of Knight to inherit Godmersham in Kent and the other Knight lands. Reverend Knight was also curate of West Weldham and is buried in Chawton churchyard. Just after he started in his post at Chawton, his brother and another Edward Knight went for an ambitious but ugly rebuilding scheme that he began in 1838. This later involved an ambitious heating scheme in 1871 that led to a fire and destruction of the nave. The subsequent rebuild was designed by Sir Arthur Blomfield, who was the diocesan architect and crops up throughout the book. Francis Macaulay, rector of East Hampshire, was a friend plus being tutor to his nephew Montague. Right, so the next church is Upper Farringdon, which is to the south of Chawton. And it is a very pretty little church. And it has some very ancient yew trees. There's two particularly ancient ones. It isn't common to find fully split villages in the South Downs National Park, but there are a spattering of them, unlike Cambridgeshire where they are frequent. Twyford is one such, and in some ways so is Graffham and potentially Brandine. Once called Upper and Lower Street, they are now known as Upper and Lower Farringdon and have their own identities. The Norman church and its magnificent yew trees is to the north of Upper Farringdon, while the A32 zooms through the smaller Lower. The Writers' Way footpath passes to the west of the churchyard, passing through the farmyard buildings of Manor Farm. With a mid-12th century date given for both the nave and the north arcade, there is a suggestion that there was a chapel that was later extended to complete the aisle even that early on. This makes sense, as the width of the nave without the help would have seemed very narrow. The chancel was rebuilt by the rector Reverend Thomas Hackett Massey in the late 19th century. The cultural associations of this village are rich and enticing. Assisted by both the church and the local footpaths that connect it to the neighbouring villages, it allowed for both the Reverend Gilbert White and Jane Austen to be involved. Reverend Gilbert White, internationally renowned author of the Natural History of Selborne, was the curate at Farringdon from 1761 to 1784. His career in curacy is complex and includes Selborne on 3 separate occasions and as non-resident perpetual curate at Morton Pinkney in Northamptonshire from 1757 to his death. 1757 he's checking. He would have been living at his own house in Selborne and travelling to Farringdon or Newton Valence churches to carry out services and preach on the ancient paths now used by the Writers' Way. The tithe map dates to 1839. The churchyard was much larger, which is unusual, but explained by later maps showing a road was put in to the west of the church to pass through to the farmyard. Reverend John Benn was a rector, being in post from 1797 to 1857. His younger sister, Mary Harriet, was a good friend of Jane Austen's, who would walk south from Chawton to visit for tea, and Miss Benn was a regular visitor to the Austens at Chawton. Reverend Benn's successor was Reverend Thomas Hackett Massey, who was an oddity who preached to a dwindling congregation behind a screen and had built the extraordinary Massey's Folly down the road from the church. It really is a bizarre building. The construction took decades, as it was one lone bricklayer doing the work with the help of a carpenter, and the client was picky, which meant certain things had to be taken down and begun again until he was happy. Of further note are those yew trees. The larger was reportedly already 30 feet in circumference in Reverend White's time. It is now more fragile as it ages, and work has been needed to prop up some of it. They frame the approach to the church from the southwest with neatly clipped hedges below them. Around the boundary are some fine ornamental cedar trees. Warnford Park, Church of Our Lady. Back to the pictures. I've got a greeting card of Chawton Church, but the other three are just photographs in the book. That's bleaching it out. It's a very dramatic tower. Extraordinary tower. Right, so this is the first of the South Downs churches in the book. I'm doing them in a different order to the order they come in the book, to have a sort of a link to Jane Austen. It did become fascinating how many had echoes, but her writing was very much about the East Hampshire that she knew and the people she knew in it, and it is interesting to remark upon it. Warnford Church is an ancient oddity, lying as it does, surrounded by beautiful Grade 2 registered parkland that may have involved capability brown and specimen trees, but devoid of a mansion to go with it. Near to the church are the ruins of St. John's House, which I naively thought would be some sort of priory remnants. Built in the 13th century, that house was owned and occupied by the St. John family, with medieval fish ponds nearby, and is a scheduled monument. Warnford Park is in the Mearn Valley. I parked next to the river at Warnford Bridge and walked down a shady footpath through the park, which gave a secret garden feel. The church stands near the scorched earth site of Warnford House. The house was still there in Mee's day, that's Arthur Mee, the King's England, being demolished in the 1950s. The theory is that a church was founded by St. Wilfrid and then rebuilt by a Norman baron. The tower is Norman. Inscriptions over the south doorway and north doorway once recorded Adam de Port rebuilding the church sometime between 1171 and 1213, probably in 2 phases. St. Wilfrid's travels in the 680s on his mission to convert the South Saxons to Christianity mean that many of the churches in the Mearn Valley are thought to sit on the sites of earlier buildings dating to Wilfrid's time in Hampshire. The fine tower of the church looms through the trees, with round windows at the top looking unexpectedly like an emoji face. Mature yews grow in the churchyard, and to the north ravens were calling out from the high trees of a rookery. As with all the other Mearn Valley churches, it lies on the Mearn Valley Pilgrim Trail. In 1754, we get to Jane Austen here, sort of. John Smith de Burgh, 11th Earl of Clanricarde, bought the estate. I don't know how you pronounce Clanricarde. He had been called Burke until 2 years before, but by 1752, his urge to appear more Norman Irish took over. He called his new house Belmont and embellished it and the park with a number of fashionable features, including turning St. John's house into a scenic ruin. The River Mearn was diverted to create a loop lake with sluices that nudged towards the idea of Brown or his team's involvement. Water management was a feature of Brown's work at Petworth and elsewhere. Ulick John de Burgh, who was to inherit West Dean only to sell it and its famous library off, was born in 1802 at Warnford, when it was still called Belmont House. He became the first Marquis of Clanricarde, Postmaster General, and Ambassador to Russia. One of his daughters was named Lady Catherine de Burgh, but she was only born in 1830, so she herself couldn't have inspired the magnificent character in Pride and Prejudice, but maybe a forebear she was named for could have done. The tithe map is dated 1839. The house is shown as very prominent, with the church enclosed and a sort of pleasure ground surrounding it. The building was still called Belmont House. The parsonage was across the road from the park. The rector was Reverend Richard Hume Lancaster, who held the post from 1802 to 1853. Reverend Lancaster was a marine, landscape and topographical painter who exhibited at the Royal Academy as an honorary exhibitor for many years, and his paintings are regularly sold at auction today, although not local Warnford scenes. When I did a trial run of this, I was talking faster. Right. Church of St. Nicholas at Wickham. This is the fourth, and the connection is obviously the name. There's no identified connection with Jane Austen, but it's a stunning church. We didn't find the church car park until we had finished visiting this dramatic, fine but slightly sad Norman church. Instead, we parked on the edge of the medieval town of Wickham, outside the Chesapeake Mill, which was built using timbers from HMS Chesapeake that were riddled with shot in a battle of the American War of Independence, and walked along the old railway line and bridge, now a cycle path. This gave us a good view across to the church from the bridge. With a dramatic exterior, it felt strange to enter to a smallish interior with a number of nooks and crannies and a dramatic swimming pool tomb to the Uvedales. I explained swimming pool. It's 5-star hotels. You've got to have a swimming pool. 5-star churches in the church's book by Simon Dudar. And 1,000 Best Churches. The 5 stars, you have to have a big tomb. So we called them swimming pool tombs. It is a cruciform church and is literally meters outside the national park boundary, although it feels very much as though it is outside on a number of counts. It sits on higher ground to the east of the town, cut off from it by the River Mearn, the line of the railway and the bridge that crosses the road, and the fast-running road now called the A32. There is a sad sense that its rather isolated position makes it a target, and the layout of the churchyard grounds with scattered entrances and buildings would make an environmental psychologist have a lot to say. The church has its Norman doorway. The date given is 1126. Otherwise, most of the church has a dating to the 12th or 13th century, with a virtual rebuild in 1862. It sits on a pagan, prehistoric mound, which may have been the site of one of St. Wilfrid's earliest Hampshire churches or chapels. It was originally built beside the manor house, known as Place House, which was in the corner of land opposite the church, now under modern housing called Glebe Corner. This was where the village started to grow, but after the lord of the manor gained a royal charter for a market or fair in 1269, the villagers crossed the river to be nearer to it. A bit gormlessly, I hadn't realised that Wickham was the birthplace of William de Wickham, 1324 to 1404, the Bishop of Winchester, Chancellor of England, founder of Winchester College and New College, Oxford. Although born poor, he was mentored by the Uvedale family from Place House. The Uvedale monument is described in me. It is alabaster and dates to 1615. In approximately 1824, Place House was demolished by the then Lord of the Manor, Reverend William Garnier, then rector of Droxford, who was rebuilding Rooksbury in its extensive parkland and set away from the church, isolating it even more. Rooksbury's to the northeast of Wickham. A church school was built on the site in 1896, closing at it as it also needed to move nearer to its pupils, with a new one built in the 1980s. The tithe map is dated 1840. Oddly, the majority of the town has been cut out, drawn that way so that it could be enlarged without enlarging the entire map, and put into the corner of the map. This idea is odd, partly because it ended up by clipping the church out of the box, leaving it rather orphaned next to the whole. It was parcel number 1 as well. Reverend Jonathan Stackhouse Rashley was the rector. His father had also been rector. The family had estates in Cornwall. Reverend J.S. Rashley was rector for 56 years, and he was followed by his own son. The patron was also Rashley, following the purchase of the manor by a forebear in 1724. The family kept the advowson after they sold the manor in 1764. This meant that the link with Menabily in Cornwall remained for a long time into the next century. The Mearn Valley Railway opened in 1903, putting Wickham Station a bit to the north of the town, following some landowner spats. So that's the reading for tonight, and thank you for sticking with me. And some of that. This is the pre-final edit of the text, so it will be sort of put into a neater form, possibly a bit odd. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, many thanks for joining me for this reading, and if you're interested in learning more, and possibly saying you want to buy a copy in the future, I don't know what the price is going to be yet, then my website is in the description and is www.tiliapublishinguk.co.uk. And I think I'm talking about lichens tomorrow night. Just to this a varied coverage. Anyway, many thanks, and wishing you a very good evening, and cheers. Good night.